As you know, this is the panel on the causes of conflict. And so before I make a few introductory remarks, I'd like to introduce our distinguished guests. To my immediate right is Professor Michael Scharf, the John D. Verdrinko and Baker Hofstadter Professor of Law and Director of the Frederick K. Cox International Law Center at Case. Okay. Following him is Professor Paul Robinson, a professor in the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa. After him is Lieutenant Colonel John Stark from Mount Summit, Indiana, and currently Professor of Military Science at Princeton University and graduate of West Point. Jeffrey Helsing is the Dean of Curriculum at the Academy for International Conflict Management and Peacebuilding at the United States Institute of Peace. He oversees much of the USIP's educational outreach in the United States and oversees development, most of the Institute's training courses and workshops. And finally, we have Major Jose Carlos Teixeira, Lieutenant Colonel in the Brazilian Army Artillery Branch. All of these distinguished guests are going to be talking about the causes of conflict and then the possible resolutions to conflict. My name is Jerry Piven. I teach philosophy here at Case. And as somebody who studies the history of ideas, I find it confounding how the history of humanity is one so replete with violence. Toward the end of Hamlet, we see an army marching over a clod of barren ground, and Hamlet muses, what can the purpose of such bloodshed be? It's so tempting to sympathize with Nietzsche's idea that history really is a madhouse. We have some 14,600 recorded wars in human history. How do we explain this? Sometimes we have very simplistic answers, cliches, some of which may shed light, some which don't. We talk about oppression, imperialism, colonialism, economic conditions, oppression, and those all seem to make sense, but given that history of bloodshed, is that enough to explain our proclivity toward violence? Does it explain the rage, the excess? Does it explain how soldiers could bayonet babies during the rape of Nanking or force fathers to rape daughters? Does it explain Sayyid Qutb's belief that what is so evil about the West, for example, is that there's a free mixing of the sexes? Right. Does it explain the misogynistic violence? Does it explain the kinds of things Dupre talks about in The Survivor when he says that Nazi soldiers would force Jews to clean the latrines with their faces? There seems to be such an incredible excess. Does it explain the current Islamophobia, for that matter? There's so much to conflict that we need to unearth beyond the simple explanations. There are many theories of violence. Some people see violence as merely the expression of human nature, right, coming out. Some thinkers talk about the psychological need for enemies and allies that is part and parcel of what it means to be human. A Buddhist philosopher friend of mine talks about the inner void in the self that motivates us to attack others. And recent research on violence, for instance, can talk about humiliation, or even, as some of the terror management theorists say, the fear of death that can inspire ordinary, seemingly rational people to harm those deemed different. So I'm going to open this up to the group. How do we explain conflict? And then afterward, what can we do about it? Gentlemen?
Do you want to go in any particular order? Or?
No, I'd like you to fight it out.
I'm happy to jump in if you want us to just kind of go down the list. So I came to this issue years ago when I was an attorney advisor at the U.S. Department of State, and I was assigned to work on the legal issues involving the breakup of the former Yugoslavia. And those led to a terrible ethnic outbursts, ethnic fighting, religious fighting, ultimately genocide. And the international community decided to create an international tribunal to hold accountable those who were responsible. And my very first book, Balkan Justice, details the story of that trial. And I remember very much in detail the day when I was in the courtroom watching as the chief presiding judge, who had been an American. She was a former civil rights attorney who had become a judge in the United States, and she, along with 2 other international judges, were presiding over this trial. And she looked out at the expert witness from the UN, and she shook her head and she said, "I just don't understand this." And the expert witness, Hans-Sophie Grev, says, "Well, Your Honor, let me try to help you understand it. Where are you confused?" She says, "Well, this country, Bosnia, was a country that had the best level of interreligious marriage of any country in the world, even in the United States. It was a country where the ethnic groups had gotten along so well that it was showcased recently in the Winter Olympics. And all of a sudden there's a conflict, and it rises to the level of genocide, and people kill each other, and they know the people they're killing their neighbors, and they do it with such zeal. How could this happen?" So Hans-Sophie Grev, the UN expert, looked at her and she tried to think, I've got to explain this in a way that this judge from the United States will understand. And she said, "Well, Your Honor, picture what would happen in the United States if all of the newspapers and all of the radio stations and all of the TV stations were all controlled by the government. And that the government then started to beam these broadcasts, these newscasts, to the population 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, saying, for example, that let's just say, and this is her words, that the African Americans were going to rise up and kill all the white people. And then the government armed all the white people, and the people said, 'Why are you giving us guns?' And they said, 'Because the African Americans are about to rise up and arm you.'" She said, "Can you imagine what would happen in the United States under those circumstances?" And Judge McDonald, who was African American, thought about it, and she says, "Okay, I see your point." And the point is this. As you alluded to at the beginning, Hobbes had it right. There is a thin line between civilization and barbarism. And what keeps us on the right side of the line is government and free press. And when the government takes over the free press and can control all the information that's going out, and when the government becomes controlled by people whose politics indicate that to maintain power it would be useful to find some kind of an enemy, and this happens all over the place, that's the ingredient for mass ethnic violence, for genocide, and for conflict. To answer your question, at least with one respect, how does genocide occur? How does this mass ethnic racial or religious violence occur? Well, we know the ingredients, and those ingredients were proven in that court case. They were proven a couple of years later by the Rwanda tribunal that sits in Arusha, Tanzania. They've been proven just daily now in the Cambodia tribunal, which is finishing its second trial now in Cambodia. So we're learning quite a bit about it, and one of the scary lessons is if we don't have a free press, the government can unleash the worst in humankind, and that will lead us down this terrible road.
I mean, conflict per se is a natural part of any human society because different people have different interests, and so will always be in conflict with one another. So the question really is why people choose to resolve conflicts with force. And at an individual level, that's fairly explicable. If you can't get it any other way, it's a nice, easy way to do it. Collectively, though, it's harder to explain because collectively it rarely makes sense from a purely cost-benefit analysis. Very, very few wars make a profit collectively. Right? So, I mean, even if you achieve your collective goal, you normally do so at a price which is not worth it. And very often you don't really have a collective goal anyway when you start. The war aims are not very clear. So from a purely sort of collective rationality perspective, it doesn't make sense as a human activity. But it can make sense for certain individuals or groups. So although collectively it is not a profitable undertaking, certain people believe it and certain people profit from it. And the problem, therefore, is one of structure. Okay, it's that power is in the hands of certain people in an imbalanced way. And also, the elites who make the decisions tend to think in a certain way which is not always very sensible from my personal point of view. American sociologist C. Wright Mills once said, but the problem with for instance, the US foreign policy and security establishment was that they were imbued with what he called crackpot realism. That's to say, they think they're realists and that they understand how the world operates, but they only ever talk to themselves, and as a result, their realism is actually completely crackpot. Okay, but unless you think like that, you won't get a job or be taken serious. You're not considered a serious person, right? So it's not just people tend to blame George Bush or whatever, but it's not just George Bush or whatever. There's a way of thinking within the establishment which is not easily broken, and there are interests which mean that even though something is collectively stupid, it happens anyway. That's one problem, and we just heard talk about, imagine if the press was controlled by the government. Well, it is, even in democracies, surprisingly controlled. The United States, for instance, has a grand total of about 100 foreign correspondents. That's how many US journalists are based overseas. About 100. They're in London, Paris, Tokyo, Beijing. Nowadays they'll be in Baghdad and Kabul, and that's basically it. So the way the modern press writes stories is they copy government press releases and company press releases, and they read the Reuters or the UPI or whatever press release, and they plagiarize it, they copy it, because they have to do it by 5 minutes' time. Right? And there's fewer and fewer journalists in big corporations. They have to get the news out quicker and quicker. So basically, they copy. Okay, that's why if you read different newspapers, you'll find it's pretty much the same story in all of them, often the same words. Okay, so it is actually remarkably easy to manipulate the press, even in a democratic country. And you could see this in the build-up to the Iraq War. Okay, you keep churning out stories about weapons of mass destruction or whatever, and all the journalists will just copy them down, shove them on the newspaper, and that's it. So we're not even as immune to that in our societies as we would like to imagine. Another point which prevents us analyzing things rationally, collectively, are you might call psychological failings of both individuals and groups. We're not very good as human beings at making rational judgments. We tend to, for instance, analyze risk extremely badly. We become extremely terrified by an act of terrorism, for instance, whereas in fact we're a million times more likely to be killed in a car crash, because car crashes happen every day and you adjust to them and you think you can control them. Terrorism, you can't. And therefore you overreact to dangers which aren't really very dangerous. Okay, so, and that's just one. Many psychologists here could probably give us more. There's a whole bunch of other psychological failings, which means that we don't really act very rationally, and as a result we think that resorting to violence will help us when in fact it generally, collectively speaking, doesn't. So that's just a few starters.
Okay, I guess it's my turn. And being in uniform at the Peace Summit, it might seem that I am the emissary of war, but I assure you that I have an interest in peace that probably goes at least as hand in hand with my colleagues here, maybe even beyond, because I have been stationed in Iraq, and I wear a bracelet of my comrades' names who have died in combat. And I feel very strongly that this event and things like this are very healing for the country. I appreciate the young people that have come here, the veterans, the scholars. It's a very great group of Americans, and also international guests. It's really great to see you all here. Thank you for inviting me, Shannon. I'm going to give you 3 ways of thinking about the causes of conflict that are not mine. I am at heart a soldier. I'm an armor officer. I grew up not far from here. I could probably relate to your lives, except I grew up in the 70s and 80s with a dose of sports and Ronald Reagan Cold War patriotism, and joined the military so that I could go to college for free. And you may not have had to do that. I don't know if all of you have scholarships, but I grew up in a trailer park in Indiana, so I thought the military was a very enticing way to pay for my education. And it has continued to educate me, sent me to Ohio State to get a PhD, and I've taught at West Point history, and I've taught at Princeton. I'm teaching now there a history course. So I look at the world like a historian, but I'm also a soldier. There are three ways to look at this problem from my perspective that are very useful. One is very simple. There's a friend of mine at Princeton. He teaches anthropology. His name is Miguel Centeno, and he's writing a book right now about the causes of conflict. And he looks at human beings as one of many species on the planet that engage in conflict, organized conflict, or something that looks like war. Ants get together and wage war on each other. Believe it or not, apes do it. What makes humans different? We deliberate about it. We have philosophies about it. We talk about it. We vote on it. And then we do it, even if it may or may not look like it's the only option. We still do it sometimes. This may not give you hope for humans if we are looking like ants and apes. However, there's examples in his study where you can look at the Vikings in the 800, 900, the 9th, 10th centuries. They were very violent peoples. And now you could not imagine Norway and Sweden going to war with each other, or a bunch of guys rowing out in a boat and raping and pillaging on the coast of England. It wouldn't happen. So there is hope, and his study is, how do we get to that, where everyone can be like Denmark? Well, that may not be the only example. I think that study is interesting, but there's two other ways of looking at it that I consider more important, because people are actually using them to justify conflict, not as a hope to stop it. The clash of cultures theory, Samuel Huntington, is the idea that we're all kind of we grow up in our own culture. You guys are here in Ohio, and you like the Browns, and you don't like war, but your culture is threatened by somebody else, somewhere else, who grows up doing something different, with a different religion or with a different thought process, and they are scared of us invading them with eBay and Coca-Cola and McDonald's, and so we develop fears and we fight each other. That theory is not so hopeful, and it says that we'll probably be fighting each other forever. And it is based in culture. It is not based in our species. A third theory, which I happen to like, but which our panel leader here will tell me is very teleological and Western-oriented. Yeah. It is. The End of History and the Last Man by Francis Fukuyama. He's a Harvard scholar. And his idea is that world history is a nice story that ends with democracy, and now democracy is the genie that's been let out of the bottle. And over time, there's been a growth of the number of democracies. Democracies don't fight each other. Democracies end up negotiating and figuring out a way to resolve conflict without fighting. And even if Iran and North Korea and Hugo Chavez came up with a lot of nuclear weapons, or Obama went insane and bombed the whole world and almost killed everyone, the people that came out of the caves would want democracy because it's such a great system and we've proven it right. And it will succeed again. This is a theory. Now, the end of history is we've reached the pinnacle of human development with democracy. The last man part of it is there's always going to be someone somewhere else who wants to restart history and cause conflict because they don't like this result. I tend to like that theory, and I think that is what we are seeing with terrorism, people who do not like the result of democracy. But I'm very biased, I am very patriotic, and I do believe that democracy is the worst system of government in the world except for all the rest, as you may have heard that before. But the clash of cultures is still alive, and we are a species which does have the instinct to fight each other. It's very complicated. Those answers will not satisfy you and give you something simple to go home and write these three theories down and that solves your wars. but that's the way that I look at it. Thanks.
I'm going to try and build on a couple of things that I've heard and also throw a few other ideas out for consideration. The first thing that jumped out at me when I heard the moderator was he interchanged two proclivities, a proclivity to conflict and a proclivity to violence. I would agree with the first, but not the second. I don't think there is a human proclivity to violence. I think there is a proclivity to conflict. Our challenge is to manage conflict in ways that we don't need to use violence. And in fact, most human beings don't resort to violence. The problem we have is that out of the fear that Colonel Stark talked about, we oftentimes have those who do engage in violence, but that's not most people. In fact, the biggest problem has less to do with those who commit violence than those who are enablers of violence or those who are bystanders while violence occurs. And what's critical is to develop institutions, to develop processes, both globally and locally, that enable people to deal with their differences, disagreements, conflicts without resorting to violence. That's one of the strengths of mature, deep-rooted democracies, is that they create institutions, laws, procedures that allow for the peaceful resolution of disagreement. Because democracy itself, if you think about it, I mean, think about the election process we're going through in this country that will culminate in elections next Tuesday. There's a lot of conflict. And it's a conflict of ideas, it's a conflict of parties, it's a conflict of visions. The key is to develop ways in which you deal with those conflicts in peaceful ways. To promote democracy in societies that don't have those institutions, to promote elections before you have a strong rule of law, to promote elections or competition before people have the confidence that it's not simply a winner-take-all, one-shot chance at political power, you're going to have conflict. Many of you may not have been in this room for the previous session, but an interesting activity took place, which was an activity to send messages and hopes for peace all around the world via the use of flags. That is, to have a blessing that was articulated for 192 countries. What was interesting about it from a standpoint of conflict is that there were 3 flags that were in this ceremony, Tibet, Taiwan, and Palestine, that actually simply holding up those flags in some areas are actually conflict-inducing. One could also have said, well, why weren't the flags of Kurdistan or Mindanao or Chechnya also included? In other words, what choices are made about nationality, self-determination, who has a right to become a nation or not? So one of the things that I think is really critical to think about in terms of conflict is that identity is a critical component of conflict, because we don't see, as we did in much of the 20th century, we don't see states and actually soldiers in uniform fighting most of the conflicts in the world today. And I certainly respect the names on Colonel Stark's bracelet, but we are now in a world where actually few soldiers, in a relative sense, lose their lives in war. 90% of the casualties are civilians.
It's certainly a lot less than in your day.
Absolutely. But partly what we need to focus on is the impact of violence on people who themselves are not armed, are not engaged in violence, don't respond to violent means, because what we've done, we've seen a world of what we might call conflict entrepreneurs, people that benefit from conflict. The ethnic cleansing in Bosnia was really the result of those elites who were looking for political power and who were profiting from resources, the distribution of resources, the distribution of power, and they were fomenting fear and hatred. And what's remarkable, if you look at most conflict zones, is that even in the midst of that kind of fear, hatred, sort of demonizing the other, most people aren't engaged in the violent killing. Most people are actually just scared. They are bystanders, or they may be enablers. They may help provide public support for those who are carrying out the violence because they simply believe, if not us, then those people, if not them, then those people are going to do it to us. And so one of the things that it's incumbent upon the international community is to help develop institutions, means of dealing with inequities of distribution of resources, but also inequities of access. I mean, when you think about it, that if you're in Bosnia, part of the concern was that those other guys were going to gain control of not just resources such as money or minerals or arms, but also who's going to control education. What about access to health care? What about access to one's livelihood, jobs? If you don't have a system that's equitable, minorities will feel that, in fact, they can't provide for basic needs. And one has to look at these structural causes of conflict that then can be exploited by conflict entrepreneurs, fearmongers, unscrupulous political leadership. And so it's important to address causes that are linked together and not just focus on, well, human beings are just violent and therefore we have to find ways of keeping people apart or find ways of, in a sense, dealing with the Hobbesian world that we live in. I think we need to think much more about, I suppose, a more Lockean view of the world in which that as human beings we can find ways of preventing, managing, and reducing the negative consequences of conflict. Too often we look just at the failures, but there are successes. And let me just mention two very briefly. One, the Crimean War. Not the Crimean War of the 19th century of the Charge of the Light Brigade, but the Crimean War that actually didn't happen after the breakup of the Soviet Union, in which two nuclear-armed countries, Russia and Ukraine, in fact, had a great deal of conflict over the disposition of the Crimea, partly because there was a majority of ethnic Russians in a territory that came under Ukrainian sovereignty. There was a lot of effort put into keeping a lid on conflict and tensions in Crimea in the mid-1990s through institutions like the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, through diplomacy, through working with local leaders, Russian and Ukrainian, in the Crimea. But unfortunately, we don't talk much about that. We don't teach about this in political science or international affairs in most cases. You think about another interesting example, the country of Mali, in which after there were violent conflicts. Some of them were identity-based, tribal, that there was the future of Mali was in significant jeopardy, even though you had in the 1990s an end that is officially to conflict. You had a peace agreement, you had political arrangements, violence was still percolating, and through a series of conflict resolution and mediation efforts at the local level that actually percolated upwards and that got embraced by the larger political process in Mali, Mali has actually had peaceful transitions of government, changes in power, and has developed conflict management techniques that have, in fact, are much more prevalent throughout much of the society. Again, violence that was prevented, but case that is not studied, is not taught. So I think we have to be very wary of just being cynical and pessimistic and just say, well, we have a proclivity to violence, and that's what we have to focus on, because what we also have to focus on is developing strong institutions of peace building at the global as well as at the local level.
Well, I guess it's my turn now. Good morning for all. I would like to say that it's a great honor to be here, and I thank for the invitation from Channel, and I thank you to be here with us. Well, I think that my colleagues pointed a lot of good points about the aspects of law, social aspects, political aspects, economic aspects. I just wish to point some psychological aspects that will not be an answer, but surely will be another questions that will be pointed to be solved altogether with those points. I think that Sigmund Freud, when he wrote Civilization and Culture, he said something that any man could not kill the beast he had inside himself. So there is a piece of nature that lies behind any social conflict. We have in Latin an aphorism that says homo homini lupus. That means man is a wolf to man himself. I think this is yet the very main question. This may be the original guilty of our civilization, and at the same time, that's why we are a species that think, because we can transform all this guilty and all these thoughts also into evolution, also into mercy. So the social phenomena is not only determined only by reason. There is much of emotion. There is much of symbolism in it. If you give attention to our uniforms, you will see, for example, mine that's green. It is green because it, of course, reminds the camouflage. And you can see our badges that are signs of our ranks. You see the medals that symbolize things we have done and that were valorized as good. But also, many times, they are a kind of a scar in our own skins, because we pay a price, and many times a sinful price for that. So we can hear this from many veterans here, and we do this with pride. We do this because we obey orders and because we want to protect our society and ourselves. Again, the conflict will arise always on the reflection of these tensions that our social structure suffers, the tensions that we ourselves as a society build. So I think that there is really a kind of aggressive instinct to survive, not to survive as a body, but to survive as a culture, survive as an economic system, survive as a political system. I would remind another writer that I like very much. He is called Zygmunt Bauman. He wrote a very interesting book called Liquid Modernity. In his writing, he says that during last century, we had something like solid modernity. He means solid because he tells us that the values, the culture at that time was much more reasonable for those people than it might be now. Or B, what was right and that was done. So decisions were very easy to do. Remembering World War II, it was very easy to choose a side, to be with the good guys or to be the bad guy. And afterwards, we have seen a period of great improvement. Meaningless, we were living a Cold War. Zygmunt Bauman also tells us that in our present century, we live a kind of liquid modernity because our values are not so stable. They are always changing. We cannot keep them always the same way. And why does this happen? Maybe because we have some difficulty to understand the other. We have a difficulty to understand diversity. And in our society, we have too many choices to do. It's easy to remind that in last century, we didn't have too many choices of employment. You would be a doctor, an engineer, a clerk. But nowadays, can you imagine the diversity of jobs we have? And yet we have plenty of unemployment. Last century, when someone had a bicycle, a motorcycle, a car, a house, that was almost lifetime worthy. Nowadays, we want to change it every time. We must buy every new model car we can, and we borrow for this, and we are getting stuck in borrowing money. So, behind all these liquid values that are ephemeral, we are just a little bit lost. We are just fearing something that the society maybe does protect us enough because we have so much to choose. I think that the violence, that animal that Freud said that lives with us, when we feel insecure, we are not so able to secure this beast. On the other hand, I think that this moment is a very good moment for our evolution as people, as nation, because it forces us to change these values among ourselves, among our governments, among our needs, so that we can understand better each other and understand us, ourselves, so that we can be really responsible for our choices, for our cooperation. In this summit, I have observed some testimonies that it is possible. For example, when I've seen the activity of Ed Nick, when he heals profound hurts from the veterans, I just thought, we as citizens of a society, even civilians, I think we have to our scars. Violence is not on the battlefield. Violence is in our cities. Violence is in our lives. We must remember about the violence against children, against women, and why not economic violence. We must heal maybe ourselves. Maybe our society is seeking for healing. And again, I think that Sigmund Freud again is telling us something important, that we must treat ourselves, and treating ourselves, we will treat our society, and getting to know each other, getting to hear each other, it would be easier.
Well, we have about 15 minutes before we open it up to the floor for questions. So what I'd like to do is ask our distinguished panel a few questions based on what they said. And I found it all extremely fascinating and somewhat perplexing. And at first I'd like to address what Dr. Teixeira said. If indeed we have this beast inside us, it certainly behooves us to recognize that it's us and not only the other. Yeah? It behooves us to examine ourselves and our own proclivities to violence and so forth. And yet, I have to ask this question. What is the nature of this so-called beast? Yes, we have it, but what is it? The other panel members each weighed in, I think, in a very articulate, beautiful way about it. Dr. Sharfer, you alluded to Hobbes. And when Hobbes says that life is nasty, solitary, brutish, and short, not that hobbits are nasty, brutal, and short, but that life is nasty, solitary, brutal, and short, why is this the case? Why are we so brutal? Hobbes himself talks, at least in part, about fear, the fear of death, the fear of not knowing what happens after we expire. And some of you also dwelt upon that. Dr. Stark also talked about the conflict of civilizations and our fear as well. Dr. Helsing mentioned fear and the demonization, the hatred. And I wonder, where do these come from? What inspires the terror and the anxiety and the hatred and the demonization? And I'm reminded of some experiments that friends of mine have done where they enacted what they called mortality salience inductions. They subliminally scared people with reminders of their own death. And they could motivate people, for example, to be sadistic to each other without the person realizing they were being sadistic to each other. Can you imagine this? You have these guys experimenting on short-order chefs where when they give them a mortality salience induction, they put twice as much hot sauce in the food of those they perceive to be in different ethnic groups without realizing it. right? We're that susceptible to fear that we're willing to be sadistic, even on a very banal, ordinary level. More recently, they did experiments where they gave mortality salience inductions, and even Democratic-minded people who thought Bush was insane started to support Bush's ideas because the fear acted on them that way, right? So I ask, what is this human nature? What is this beast? What is the nature of that beast? What is the complex psychological architecture of humanity that distinguishes us from the ants or the lions that Dr. Stark mentioned? Because I suspect that we are, as Dr. Teixeira said, symbolic animals.
I could jump in here.
Please jump.
If you like. The whole discussion of whether humans are naturally violent is one which I set my students every year. But there's a lot of literature too, and it's very controversial. You'll get many zoologists who will say that certain types of animals are inherently violent for good evolutionary reasons. There are others who say no, and then you get into discussions of chimpanzees versus bonobos, and bonobos are genetically the same as chimpanzees, but allegedly less violent, except new research suggests that perhaps they're not actually, they're just as violent. So it's all, it depends who you read and all the rest of it. One thing we can say for certain is men are more violent than women. This is a natural phenomenon. There's a close association between hormonal balances and levels of violence. I think this is fairly clear. However, it's not just a natural phenomenon, it's also a cultural one. Okay, it's how, for instance, how masculinity is interpreted, not just the fact that men are naturally more violent. So, I mean, the sort of historical process would go something like this, but historically a society was prone to threats, and therefore to protect itself needed people who were strong, courageous, and good with weapons. So it encourages people to be strong, courageous, and good with weapons by giving them honors. And people respond to honors, and so they try and be strong, courageous, and good with weapons. But how do they prove that they're strong, courageous, and good with weapons? Well, they have to fight someone. So a process which begins as a way of protecting society eventually sort of ends up threatening it. But this then creates a cultural phenomenon whereby honor and status are associated with strength. And we know, one thing we do know about human nature, I mean, or at least some modern medical research would suggest, is humans are very naturally concerned with status. There's some interesting research done with monkeys and with British civil servants as well, which shows that your health is directly related to your status, not wealth, because beyond a certain level of wealth, there's no reason to be healthy or less healthy. It's your status which matters. And you can do experiments with monkeys where you move them around from pack to different pack, and you can show that according to their level in the pack, they have different levels of stress hormones. And the higher up you are, the less stress hormones you have, and the lower down you are, the more stress hormones. And if you then moved into a different pack with a different level, your stress hormones change. Which means that actually having status is crucial to your health, and we really naturally care about it. There's an inherent drive to get status. Okay, so that is part of the human nature. The question then is, why is status associated with violence and competition? Well, it's that historical process, that cultural process, which means that showing strength is what all it's about. And therefore, the problem is that societies make, particularly the elites, who make decisions, feel that they must appear to be strong, right? And there's some interesting things with LBJ. For instance, someone asked him why he's in Vietnam. Allegedly, he took down his trousers and said, "That's why we're in Vietnam." He told his biographer that he had dreams of people shouting at him, "Weak, wimpling, coward." But to him, Vietnam was about his masculinity, that is in part, a natural phenomenon, but it's also it's a cultural one, because we have associated through the eras, power and strength and honor. So culturally, the way to eliminate war is to disassociate honor and strength and prowess and war fighting. And I'm not sure democracy is necessarily the way to do that, because democracy tends to promote people who care about applause. One British psychologist said, he's a psychologist, Andrew Storr, I think his name is, Anthony Storr, and he's a psychologist to politicians, and he says the one thing they all have in common is a desire for applause. But capitalism and free markets and wealth create alternative avenues through which you can satisfy this innate desire. And as a result, your society will tend to I think, eventually, over the long term, to become more peaceful. I also think that if a society was truly run by women, it would probably be more peaceful too.
Well, okay. I like the idea of a gynocracy. What does the rest of the panel have to say about this?
Let me just chime in for a minute. I do think that often war is caused by the elites and by the leadership, and it's interesting how often countries will say, we don't have anything against the United States, Iraq said, we just hate President Bush, and I think we said similar things probably about Ahmadinejad or Chavez and some of the other leaders. Now, the one thing that really distinguishes us from the animal kingdom is that we have systems of justice. We uniquely do this. And this is something that we are starting to, in a Kantian way, build up so that we have mechanisms to deter and make war less likely and to be more costly to those who are committing them. So we have seen now in the last 20 years the proliferation of international criminal tribunals, starting out with the Yugoslavia Tribunal that I told you about before, the Rwanda Tribunal, the Cambodia Tribunal, the Sierra Leone Tribunal. There's now a permanent international criminal court. And the idea of these tribunals is that they create a historic record so that, as George Santayana, the famous American historian, once said, if we don't remember the lessons of the past and the mistakes of the past, we will continue to be making those mistakes into the future. That was a terrible paraphrase, but you get the idea. Also, the idea of these international criminal tribunals is that they avoid collective guilt, so that you don't have an example, Nazi Germany rose up because of the collective punishment that was instituted on Germany after World War I in the massive reparations. You have justice for the victims so that they don't need to take it into their own hands and have vigilanteism. And then there is evidence growing that where there's a reasonable likelihood that people will be prosecuted for these kinds of crimes, that there is deterrence. So famously, Adolf Hitler said in 1939, on the eve of the invasion of Poland, when he was going to ask his troops to commit total war, and they were saying, oh, we're not sure we want to do that, we're afraid we'll be held accountable. And he said, what are you talking about? He said, let's look at World War I. Look at what the Turks did to the Armenians. About 1 million of them were massacred. Nobody has ever been held accountable for that. And he said the famous quote, who, after all, today remembers the fate of the Armenians? And therefore, his troops could launch their total war with impunity. Now, those days are gone. We're now in an era where you see so many kinds of trials and so much discussion of international criminal accountability in parliaments. You're seeing them in TV shows. Just last week, The Simpsons, a cartoon that is shown in every country in the world, in every language in the world, had an episode where Krusty the Clown, one of the characters, was hauled before the International Criminal Court, not for crimes against humanity, but for crimes against humor. But the idea is that everybody is learning about international criminal law. It's becoming pervasive, and I think that this may be one of the ingredients that fights against the human instinct and the human compulsion to always go to war.
I'll give it a stab. In my clash of civilizations or clash of cultures, education is really the best hope that civilizations have to learn about each other, to do exchange programs. I would encourage all of the young people there to consider that. One of the great things about military life is I've been able to do that, believe it or not. I was in Tanzania this past summer in civilian clothes with a group of Army cadets who were doing an exchange program to learn what it's like to live in a third world country. I've traveled to the Ukraine and evaluated their training system so they could have a chance to join NATO, which they have not done. Not yet. And I've done something similar in Poland, and they did join. Doing those things opens your eyes to other cultures in a way that reading about it or talking about it just doesn't do. So if you have an exchange student visiting you, I would encourage you to get to know them. Ask them if you can crash on their floor. do something like that. That will help in this clash of cultures, even if it's a culture that's a lot like ours. My first place I went was to Sweden, because I did that with my Swedish exchange student. And it's not that much different from the United States, but it was enough different to make me want to see more different cultures. And I think that's something very important to the future of ending conflict. But in the end of history example, when you have the last man, the guy who is left outside of the democratic system has lost his honor. And this goes back to your point. And I really believe that that's very important. And you gave the solution, and I think it's worth repeating. You must have a society with a system that generates the economic possibility, the political possibility, the societal norm, that people have a chance to advance and have a chance to have dignity and honor. In some of the civilizations and cultures that are out there, that is very limited compared to ours. Or compared, maybe we shouldn't compare to ours. Maybe they need something different. But they have a limited sense of how you can honorably and with dignity advance your position and your status, which we've established, some people believe is very important. So maybe the military isn't the way. A war against a culture that has no chance for its men to establish dignity may be counterproductive, because now their only chance for honor is to win the war, and the war will go on forever. And that may be what we see in the global war on terror. It's one possibility that we consider. There needs to be other organizations, and there's ways to combat conflict. The best ways are probably not military. And I recognize that as a soldier. There's nothing more than I would want than for the Department of State to go to Iraq and Afghanistan and end those conflicts in a way that makes those people able to join the community of nations in a way where they can have dignity and honor. Maybe they won't have expansion teams in the NFL and open McDonald's on every corner and Starbucks. Maybe that's not the answer. But some other organization besides the military could probably negotiate that path better. So I encourage you to think of those routes as well. Pass it back to you.
No, it's beautiful. And I'm reminded, since you talk about honor so much, about the hymn to Inanna, right? Several thousand years ago, you have in the Middle East, Inanna saying, "Because you will not bow down to me, I'm going to destroy your mountains." This element of dignity and humiliation and violence and honor and so forth persists to this day. I'm sympathetic to what you're saying. I'd actually like to hear a few final comments from Drs. Teixeira and Helsing, especially since Dr. Helsing has the courage to actually teach policy and Arab-American relations and work with people in the Middle East. And I think that's something we should learn from. I sympathize with your perspective on the importance of a Lockean perspective on healing. Yeah.
Well, I actually will start. I agree with a lot of what Professor Scharf says, and I think we are moving more to, I suppose, Kantian solutions at the international level that I think we all need to support, and the world needs to put more effort into. I would argue that hatreds are often constructed, and hatred is used and manipulated, and that education is one of the crucial tools to actually undermining demonizing of the other, and that there are ways in which one can, through education, provide for opening minds to more pluralistic perspectives on the world. That simply because you are different than I am does not mean that you are a threat to me. And how do you break that down? How do you get those values? And it's difficult. Since you mentioned the Middle East, there's an interesting controversy going on in Israel right now. And it's related to the use of a textbook that I actually personally in our institution helped provide support for over the last 10 years. It's a Palestinian-Israeli textbook developed by jointly by Palestinian and Israeli teachers and historians that was meant to look at history of the last century. They initially tried to create a common narrative, and they couldn't do it. There were just so many differences between the Israeli and Palestinian perspective. So what they decided to do was create a textbook that had on the left margin the Palestinian narrative, and on the right margin the Israeli narrative. And they actually have a blank space in the middle for students to write notes, find areas of common interest, etc. For the last 10 years, they've been trying to get the respective Palestinian and Israeli ministries of education to adopt the textbook. Hasn't happened yet, although the Palestinian ministry actually announced 3 weeks ago that it was adopting it, but then changed its mind a week later because of political pressure. But there is a high school in Sderot, and I don't know if many of you know where Sderot is, but it is the community closest to Gaza. It has been under ongoing rocket attack from Palestinians from Gaza. They live with the conflict probably more than any other Israeli community on a daily or ongoing basis. A teacher decided to use this book in the classroom. The Israeli Ministry of Education has now forbidden that. This teacher and the principal were called up to Tel Aviv and were sort of hauled, taken to task, said you cannot use this, etc. One of the things that's interesting about it, and many of the students were saying, what are they afraid of? They don't think we can think for ourselves. Somehow they think we're going to be brainwashed into all of a sudden adopting the Palestinian narrative. But what's interesting is that in this us versus them dynamic, a deputy minister of education told the Israeli head of this textbook, person who conceived of this and developed it, he said that actually, from the Israeli standpoint, they weren't concerned about all of a sudden if this textbook was adopted, that Israeli youth would somehow become overly sympathetic to Palestinians, would adopt the Palestinian narrative of history. Their concern was that Israeli youth would begin to challenge the Israeli narrative of history, acknowledging, and we do this in this country with our own textbooks, that history is something to be controlled, constructed, manipulated. We all have narratives and we all have myths. And oftentimes those are used to demonize the other, to glorify ourselves. They are about heroic deeds. And so therefore, to allow the challenge of our own narrative, of our own myths, weakens us versus them. And that's why education is an oftentimes overlooked aspect of how we can reduce conflict and build up peace. There's one other thing I would also say, and there's a scholar at the University of, I think he's still at the University of Illinois, his name is Varshni. He originally was from India, and he did a number of studies of Hindu-Muslim communities in India and wanted to find out why did some of them devolve into ethnic violence while others did not. And his conclusion was that it wasn't enough simply to have Muslim-Hindu interaction, sort of playing soccer together or having dialogues together. But in fact, what was necessary was actually these communities coming together over a common problem that they had to solve collectively and collaboratively. A common problem of either building something, reconstructing something, dealing with an environmental issue, etc. Where they had worked together and had solved problems together, they were almost always going to have in place relationships, mechanisms of working together that help them, and in almost all cases, prevent violence from erupting, even though in the larger political sphere there may have been increased tension, there may have been incidences elsewhere that led to rioting in other communities, but those communities where these patterns existed, that didn't happen. So that when people work with each other, and their identities are no longer us, them, Hindu, Muslim, but that their identity bridges their collective as a community when they come together as people of a common community and they see themselves in that sort of identity form. Or when people work together as teachers across ethnic lines, or when they work together as has been the case in Israel and Palestine, environmentalists, hydrologists who have actually come together with some interesting common solutions to deal with water issues, environmental threats, etc., in which they can work across communities and not be prevented from finding interesting solutions to common problems because of political dynamics. And I think more and more we can find ways of sort of creating or breaking down those identities that, in a sense, fuel violence, lead to sort of the exploitation of differences, and find ways that people can, in fact, work together and develop patterns of cooperation and collaboration that can often transcend the narratives, the myths, the hatreds that are exploited by, again, what I call conflict entrepreneurs.
Well, the moderator had asked what would be these beasts. I would give it a name. I would call it fear. The fear we bring inside of us. And I think that this fear is fed by our insecurity feelings. And I'm sure that we can control that. We control it by education. We control it by the talking, by the working together in a community of people, of states, of nations. We can do it if you wish, and we must do it beginning with our children. I remind the ceremony that was held here before. That's why the children were here. They are hope. They are our future. We must invest them with these ideas and ideals. And we must remind ourselves that this beast is, of course, an honorable thing, but it makes part of us, and we must control it. And again, I believe that education is a very strong instrument to do that. If we put into education the sense of the necessity of responsibility, the sense of love for the other, and two, for the forgiveness for the other and for ourselves. Because I'm sure we are human and we make mistakes, but always we can try to forgive and look to be forgiven.
Can I come back on one thing? Was it?
Well, we are a little bit over.
Yeah, okay.
Possibly you could work it into some of the answers of when the audience has questions. Is that all right? Okay. I apologize for cutting you off. We only have about half an hour, maybe a little more, to entertain some questions. So I'd like to encourage anybody who wants to query the panel to form a civilized line before the microphone, and please address them.
Oh, that's okay. That's okay. We're lining up on the.
Thank you very much, first of all, for a very interesting discussion so far. I wanted to raise 2 points that I'd like to hear your response about. First of all, I should say my name is Nina McClellan, and I work closely with Cleveland Peace Action, which is an affiliate of the national organization. And we recently had a speaker come that I wondered if you had heard about. His name is Paul Chappell. He's the director of the Nuclear Age Peace Center. And he has written a number of books. He graduated from West Point, by the way, and has been an active soldier. He makes the point that we can overcome using war as a mechanism for resolving conflicts. If we make a change in how we view this, the way we did, say, with slavery. He uses that as an example, that for hundreds and thousands of years it was felt that slavery was a natural thing, and it took a great change in the worldview to change that. And he feels that that can be done, and he has a lot of examples of how cooperation and other positive traits are built into human society. So I wondered if you had heard about his work and what you would think of that. The other point I wanted to raise is that it seems to me there's, well, I guess what I would call the elephant in the living room that I feel nobody has addressed at this point, and that has to do with the strategic competition for national power and resources that often underlies governments and groups making war and conflict. And the other part of that is very disturbing to me has to do with the U.S. role, because it seems to me in the last 20 years there has been a concerted effort by those we have defined as neocons to change American belief significantly and successfully to that we should be the world superpower, that we use military force much more often and aggressively in response to issues around the world, and that we can use it preemptively, and that there's a sort of American exceptionalism that our values and ways of doing things should prevail and are the answer for everybody. So to me, this is, for many of us, this is a huge cause of conflict in the world that has been going on, whether it's Democratic or Republican administrations. Thank you.
Now, thank you for that question in 5 minutes or less.
I'd like to respond to the first question, which is how do we change the view of war so it's like slavery and everybody dismisses it as a crime instead of something that is heroic and exciting. The international community tried to do that at Nuremberg by indicting the Germans for the war of aggression charge, and they held them responsible for it. But after Nuremberg, all the other international tribunals that I've been talking about have not included within their statute the crime of aggression. You can prosecute people for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide, but not for waging an aggressive war, not for attacking another country when you don't have any right to do so, either because the Security Council of the UN has authorized it or because you're acting in self-defense. The International Criminal Court, which is the new permanent International Criminal Court, has been debating whether to add it to its statute. And I went down representing a non-governmental organization to Kampala this summer, where all the countries in the world gathered, including the United States. And at the end of a 2-week session, they decided to add to the ICC, the International Criminal Court statute, the crime of aggression. And that will kick in 7 years. And the idea and what everybody was saying there is we have to make what we tried to start to do at Nuremberg real for the future. We have to turn waging an aggressive war into something that is so despised, it's like slavery that nobody accepts. And so I think there is a movement toward that, and let's cross our fingers that that succeeds.
When the United States recognizes the International Criminal Court, I mean, we
Yeah.
put ourselves above any of those restrictions.
The Bush administration used to oppose the International Criminal Court, and that changed at the end of the Bush administration when they allowed the Security Council to refer the Darfur situation to the court. And at that point, they started to embrace the court. The United States sent the largest delegation. There were 32 people from the State Department, Justice Department, and Defense Department at Kampala, and they were very engaged in these negotiations. And at the end, instead of picking up their marbles and walking away like they had done in 1998 at the end of the Rome negotiations that created the court, they gave a press statement where they said, we can live with what has arisen from this. We feel comfortable with this, and we see ourselves having a better relationship with the International Criminal Court going forward. So I do think there's cause for optimism.
Yeah, I would strongly support the position just said about the importance of criminalizing the waging of aggressive war. At Nuremberg, the American prosecutor Robert Jackson said waging aggressive war was the worst of all war crimes, and I think that is absolutely right. If I could put your two questions together to do with the acceptability of war and the U.S. exceptionalism and so on, this is not just a matter, this is not the neocons. And I think if people just sort of say, this is a problem with the neocons, you've got it wrong. This is what I was saying. The issue here is what I was saying earlier. The idea that not merely using force can promote American power, but it's an acceptable way of doing it, is deeply, deeply entrenched within the entire defense and security community and foreign policy community, not just of the United States, but of Canada, the United Kingdom, France, and many other countries. People will often say, within those, Iraq was, Iraq, oh my, what a disaster. But the idea that actually, you didn't have a right to invade Iraq, I mean, almost no one opposes it on those sort of those grounds, or on moral grounds. If you go to the think tanks in Washington, you speak to the Center of New American Security or the American Enterprise Institute or any of these ones. There's one or two, maybe the Cato Institute might, but they'd be realists, so even then they wouldn't have moral qualms about it. The idea that there's something actually inherently wrong about this is not one they accept at all. I would recommend reading books by Andrew Bacevich, Stephen Walt, and so on. I've done some very good critiques about how this is something which is deeply, deeply entrenched within the foreign policy community. And I don't know how you can change that except by keeping on writing, keeping on protesting, keeping on acting, and hopefully that people will eventually learn by their lessons. But it will take a very, very, very long time. But all you can do is try. And that's the best I can say.
In my time at the German General Staff College, we wrestled with this problem, and as the only American student there representing the entire history of the U.S. Armed Forces, and at the time it was Abu Ghraib and invade Iraq. That's when I was there. I had to think about these same questions. And some of the conclusions that I could agree with my German colleagues, we approached the problem from very different sides. The Germans had learned from history that having an army would eventually lead to using it in an improper way, and that therefore using it outside of your borders was inherently wrong. In the American frame of history, if you don't have an army that is ready to defend your country, you will end up with Pearl Harbor, 9/11, the Task Force Smith in Korea, or some other situation that is unacceptable, and you end up with a longer war with more men dying. Now, that's probably not every American's view of it, but the people who are in charge, they kind of fall into those categories on the opposite sides, from the Europeans, as what Rumsfeld would have called old Europe, and the American Anglo Alliance on the other side. These products of history, they're hard to change. It would probably take a new dynamic, another situation where we are united in our allies in a different way. And then my Danish friend stood up and surprised me with the comment, America is looking for security, and this exceptionalism is not the way to get it. You're just making yourself a target. What about giving up some of your sovereignty to gain some security? I do not believe that most Americans who are either in charge or have their people in the military can agree on who to give that sovereignty to. who deserves it? Would we really want to give it to, you say the international community, and it sounds nice, but there are people out there who do not agree with our way of life. Should we give it to the Chinese? Should we give it to the Russians? They have their own problems. They haven't figured out their own problems, so who do we give the sovereignty to? Do we give it to the Germans? They had their own problems. They don't even want to have their own sovereignty. They're trying to give it away too. Everyone's trying to give it to someone else, and then someone has to act. And because of our history, going back to the American Revolution and Manifest Destiny, whether it was right or wrong, through Pearl Harbor, through 9/11, there is this trend of thinking that America needs to be able to defend itself and that it will not give up sovereignty come hell or high water. Now, this is a trend not just amongst the elites, but I think it's a very populist idea. It may not be among the elite educated, it may not be their idea, but it is probably more than 50% of the people who vote, and they do choose. So now I'm back to it needs to be a paradigm shift, something outrageous. Godzilla needs to attack the Earth, and we will give up our sovereignty to the UN so they can develop the super weapon and the Death Star to destroy the alien invaders. This kind of thing. Something that bizarre would probably be required. And that's just my personal opinion.
Well, I think this question is one that could be addressed at length, and I'd really like to devote the attention to it. I must apologize that we are limited in the amount of time we could spend on these questions, so please accept our forgiveness for having to address other people's questions. But I think this was very important, so thank you. Yes.
I'm Michael Phelan. So, postulated that we are naturally violent animals. If we are able to reach a point where external violence is no longer an issue, it asks to state of peace, one could say. By, in a sense, destroying a large part of human nature, what do we really accomplish?
Well, we learn. We must be able to learn from it. Because if we do these such a things, is because we have made a choice. And by making mistakes, we can learn a lot. I think that this moment is a moment for learning. I don't believe that we won't produce any kind of absolute answer to all these questions. But we can learn from ourselves much that will compose us to do the right choices in the next turn. And I think that it's a bit of democracy system. We must be responsible for our choices, and we must be educated so that we can do the right choices. But always we are responsible for that.
I'm not sure I fully understand your implication, but I would certainly say that there's a difference, and again, de-link violence and conflict. I mean, conflict can create opportunities. Conflict is not necessarily a bad thing. It's how you manage those conflicts. What I would challenge you to consider is, if you think about political, economic, or social change, in most cases, nonviolent means of achieving change has been more productive and has lasted than attempts to do so violently. Violence, if you accept that violence is an inherent and positive part of the human condition, then maybe your question makes sense. But my way of thinking, and that of many others, is that violence impedes social, political, economic change. And so it's important to try and find ways in which violence can be reduced and ultimately eliminated in a way that one can still, as a people, as a planet, we can continue to develop and create positive change.
Okay, let's take the next question.
So you talked about capitalism as a way for I guess men to channel their masculinity into achieving things, I guess.
Yeah.
And to me, it seems like that's just that's still aggression. It's still a form of aggression to exploit, the lower classes. And I was wondering why you think that that's a less detrimental alternative to war with another state.
Well, I think it really depends on your attitude towards capitalist competition. I mean, on the whole, it works better than other economic systems. I was a student in the Soviet Union many years ago, and it stank. It's not a very good system, to be honest. It does lead to all sorts of exploitative practices, but it's better than something else. And ultimately, channeling your desire for status into building a new company and getting rich is ultimately better for society than going around killing people. I mean, that's basically what I'm trying to say. And it doesn't have to be into capitalism. You can channel it into your local sports team or whatever. It doesn't. The more someone spoke about choices, one of the other speakers. Well, the more choices you give people, and the more avenues in which to vent their naturally competitive instincts, then I think the more people will be able to live. They'll be able to fulfill that side of their nature without actually killing. Okay, and that's my basic point. And I think that a capitalist society generates more of those choices.
Yeah, a number of the people in this panel seem to suggest that there were a number of ways of displacing aggression and violence into very banal activities. And this is why, Nietzsche could say that civilization was a sublimation of cruelty, and why Hannah Arendt could talk about the banality of evil, the ease with which we can inflict what does not appear to necessarily be violence on others without being culpable. And why I was recommending to some of our panel members last night this insane book by my friend Walter Davis, Death's Dream Kingdom, The American Psyche Since 9/11, because he makes the case that we have this predilection to disgorge our own psychological detritus, to project it on others and inflict our violence on them, whereas we need to be excruciatingly aggressive toward our own predilections to violence and to stop othering and inflicting ourselves on them, which is all too seductive. My 2 cents. Unless anybody has any other comments? Okay. Yes.
My name is Meena, and I come from Mumbai, that is India. I really appreciate the point which Professor Jeffrey had made about the structural and the political causes, and I'm basically referring to the India-Pakistan issue over Kashmir, which is going on. It's basically rooted in the structural and political causes. I find in my own country the military budgets keep increasing, and that is so true even for other nations. Why are the governments of these nation states not interested in developing confidence-building measures? When the military budget is increasing, I think the peace development budgets, I don't find it is increasing to that extent. It's only the non-state actors which keep talking about peace. But when hatred is constructed, either through education or through socialization systems, I think people in power really require to, take this into cognizance, and only then we can talk about sustainable peace. So my question is, can we ever achieve sustainable peace? Because the topic of the panel discussion, ends with challenges to sustainable peace.
I
I guess I'll take a shot at that. We had a conference at the law school here about a week ago looking back at the Irish Good Friday Peace Accords that are now 10 years old. And that was a situation where for 30 years nobody thought that these two factions were ever going to be able to sit down at the peace table and have a sustainable peace. Now, what helped in that case was they sort of exhausted themselves over time. There was mediation from the outside, mostly from the United States. And then ultimately, they used what I thought was most fascinating is a power-sharing equation that seems to not only have worked for them, but that is now being exported around the world and injected into other peace negotiations. And so the idea is that if you can come up with a mathematical formula so that factions can feel the lack of fear, as you keep phrasing, that they can feel secure, that they can feel that they'll have representation through this power-sharing equation, that might be an ingredient for long peace. And so far in Ireland, it's 10 years and going. So, you know, that is a model. Don't know whether it will work for Kashmir. There's a lot of other places around the world right now that are on the brink of war. One I want to bring the attention to the audience and the TV audience to is what's going on right now between North Sudan and South Sudan. Both countries are arming to the hilt. In January, there's going to be a referendum of independence by South Sudan. There was a arbitration that decided that South Sudan gets the oil fields that were on the border, and everything is ripe for major, terrible violence there. And this is a place where the world community, the United States taking the lead, has to do much more to head it off, or otherwise, when this is being shown in reruns, we're going to be remembering that this Sudan is worse than anything we've seen in recent years. Much worse than what's going on in Darfur, by the way.
And that points out, I mean, there's an interesting parallel because, as you mentioned, the United States, with respect to Sudan, China has significant investments in oil resources in Sudan. But Kashmir also suffers from the fact that there are other agendas involved. And in some cases, the conflicts may be exacerbated by the specific neighborhood one's in. So what's happening, not just in Kashmir, but the Pakistani, Afghan, and then the American and Western sort of agenda with respect to that border spills over into and creates, in some cases, obstacles to confidence-building measures that might be possible between Pakistan and India. But because there are other competing agendas, that oftentimes get sort of shunted aside. And therefore, again, the international community, and I would say in terms of the United States, there is, what we don't see today is very strong global leadership. And we don't see global leadership that is a function of cooperation and collaboration among parties, countries that have the capacity to influence the agenda of others. And, you know, one of the speakers previously talked about sort of American exceptionalism and America becoming the world superpower, et cetera. There are some who would argue that, in fact, the United States' attempt to do so actually has long passed. It met its Waterloo, if you will, in Iraq. Not because the United States couldn't show itself to be a military superpower and easily militarily, you know, end the regime of Saddam Hussein, but in fact it was what came after. The inability of the U.S. and the international community then to have other robust tools, diplomatic, economic, et cetera, that could help create opportunities for peaceful change or political transformation. That's what the international community lacks today. And even though we may be making sort of incremental progress on international law, such as the ICC, the inability to actually coalesce around those tools and use them robustly and realistically is a real problem. So that you see, you know, China is becoming a significant superpower, but not diplomatically, not politically, and not militarily, but economically. The United States has tremendous military capacity, but its economic and diplomatic power is weakening. That's a recipe for a weaker international community, not a stronger international community. So one has to look at the context in all of these things. And Northern Ireland is an interesting example because the outside powers could also come together to help facilitate that process. But where you don't have that, in combination with the powers inside a conflict, it's going to be very difficult to create sustainable peace.
If I just say one thing very quickly on this. Of course, sustainable peace is possible. There's sustainable peace between Canada and the United States. There's sustainable peace in Europe. If you look at global statistics on conflict, you'll see that the magnitude of conflict worldwide now is massively lower than it was 20 years ago.
Yeah.
I mean, the press won't tell you this, but I mean, it is true. The world is substantially more peaceful than it was. So we're moving there. It'll take time, but I'm something of a Marxist determinist, you know, as prosperity spreads and all the rest of it, the pools of violence will become more and more isolated. And you know,
But I'm not a Marxist determinist, but I also agree with you said that the trends are actually getting better, believe it or not.
I think there is a shift to a kind of collaborative leadership among nations. And I think that it will take some time, but we will arrive in international, much more stable and peaceful platform if we learn how to cooperate, to do the parts that each nation can do to achieve a sustainable peace. So it's a whole play among all the nations and among all the people of our world. If we cannot do so, we won't be prepared to live in peace.
I'm glad things are getting better. Here I was worried about the hundreds of thousands of civilians killed in Iraq. But I appreciate the optimism. Dr. Sharkey.
Well, he said my name, so I won't say it again. I'm an academic, but I'm going to take off my academic hat and talk as a human, if that's all right, because academics aren't really humans, are they? Well, that's what I've been hearing. I think that I'm a human optimist, and I think that war is inevitable as long as we think and believe it is inevitable. And I think you've been talking about a proclivity for violence, although you said it was more of a proclivity for conflict. But I think that humans also have a proclivity for peace, and you're not mentioning that. Now, I've worked in many countries around the world. I travelled the world running robot fighting competitions for many countries, around about 30 countries, and it could be Arab countries, Eastern countries, and everywhere else. And one thing I always noticed was, at the beginning of these competitions, we all meet up. It's either students or farmers or people, you know, different kinds of people, and you meet up, and there's a kind of cultural politeness and a cultural veneer. Now, I put these people under incredible pressure, under TV cameras and everything else, and within a couple of days the cultural veneer would collapse, and we were all in the same boat. They'd be crying and shouting, and there'd be all sorts of emotion. And I really got to look forward to this. At each new event, you'd watch the cultural veneer collapse, and we were all just people together. There was no difference between us. There wasn't a difference between the cultures. And that is, to me, very interesting, because you talk about a beast within. That's what you've been talking about. And I think there's another beast within, although beast is probably the wrong word, and it's a little bit corny, but I think that everybody has humanity inside them, really, and it can be brought up, and I mean everybody, even your terrorist killer strapped with bombs. If you can tap it properly, everybody has this love or spirituality or humanity deep down in them, and rather than trying to suppress other proclivities, we should be trying to bring these out, and it's just a personal opinion.
I actually wanted to ask a question that sort of builds off of what Professor Sharkey was just saying. We did discuss how humanity has a proclivity to conflict, and I was wondering, if we have a proclivity to conflict but not to violence, how you all think that that inclination towards violence enters the picture, how and when. We've been talking a lot about Sigmund Freud and other more what I would say is old school psychology, and I would like to say maybe from the perspective of more developmental psychology, like Dr. Erik Erikson in his book Identity, Youth in Crisis proposes that as adolescents, the crisis identity forms opportunities for youth to become violent and form bonds of hatred towards other cultures, eventually leading to that clash of cultures which the general was talking about. And I was wondering where you all thought that violence enters the picture and how we can prevent that. Thank you.
Well, I agree with your speech. Maybe we are living now a kind of shift. Maybe we are getting to a very mature society. So we have to overcome some crises, like in Erik Erikson theory. Maybe we are just trying to go our way out of this identity crisis. And again, I remember Zygmunt Bauman when he says that the postmodernity gives us a great possibility of choices, and this causes fear to us. And I agree also with the previous speech. I agree that we were talking a lot about Thanatos, about death. But if there is such a thing, it's because there is life, and life must be pleasurable. And of course, we always must to remember the eros, as in Freud's psychology system, let's say. We must remind us every day that the eros side of energy, libidinal energy, must be praised every day when we wake up, when we meet our friends, our wife, our children. And we must remember that any people in any culture will have the right to have this pleasure. They are not different from us, even though their way to be can seem a little bit different. So that's a necessity that we must educate our sons about diversity. I think that would be a key to achieve a more smiling world. And in this more just world, there will be problems, and there will be knowledge, laws, economics, governments to solve this problem. We cannot distrust the things we have built until this time. So our institutions, our government, also they need our support, but also need that we participate with it, that we vote, that we make our choices, and that we are, as individuals, make our part on it.
I think the choice is really important. The idea of the beast inside of us, that's only one end of the spectrum. As Professor Sharkey said, you have humanity in you. It is a spectrum, and it ranges from the most noble, heroic thing that you can imagine, the most altruistic human, all the way through to neutral, to the beast. And I would encourage everyone, the youth especially, be assured that you can make a difference. It is not that you are just an actor, an automaton, waiting for the newspaper to come out to tell you we are going to war or something else terrible has happened. It may be something small that you do. Go home and help your little brother with his homework. Something that simple. You will move someone from the beast towards the noble, altruistic, heroic ideal, whatever that is in your culture and in your home. You can have an impact. In fact, almost nothing else will have an impact. Reading books, getting smart, traveling the world, those things are great, but it is the interaction with other humans and having an example when you are young that will make you a better person and make this kind of thing solvable in the future. It probably will not be my generation, and I doubt if it will be the U.S. Army that solves the problem of sustainable peace. We can control the oceans with 12 aircraft carriers, but we can't stop someone from hating us in another country. We can't do it. And we, like he said, we really can't control the ocean either. Somewhere there is some pirate loading his boat right now, and we can't get there fast enough. But you, as an individual, you should go out like a swarm of humanity and be positive and make the world better. And that's the only thing that will work. I guarantee you that will work.
No, I think this was an excellent question, and my concern is how do we cultivate this eros that you're talking about, especially since what you're saying suggests from a psychological developmental perspective that certain elements of that violence can be encoded in the process, and that's why you have attachment theorists like Bowlby, and even more recently people like Alan Shore, who are talking about the neurobiology of attachment and how violence can be encoded into the brain and so forth. The violentization that Richard Rhodes talks about and Lonnie Athens talks about. It's very sinister stuff, and so I hope you can take what they've said and apply it toward the development of a psychology of cultivating eros. Yeah. Sorry to have interrupted you.
No, I agree with everything's been said, but I thought I'd just share one piece of research I found very interesting, a talk I went to in Montreal once, a sociologist who studied violence patterns in children from birth to 15 or something, to teenagers, and over a 20-year period, the parents had to log every violent action they spotted by their children. And they thought that teenagers would be the most violent, but actually it turned out not to be. Children are the most violent age between 2 and 4. Actually, if you had kids, you realize this is true. They're always hitting each other, right? And then after 4, it drops off dramatically, except in some kids. In some kids, it never drops off at all. And what they found was, if it doesn't drop off age 4, it never does. Right? So a lot of educational efforts are going into teenagers and so on. But if you're thinking about individual conflict and individual violence, then actually you've got to nip it in the bud age 2 or 3. Which creates some real educational development, public policy issues there.
Yeah. Well, Joseph Ledoux at NYU talks about how fear and other emotions can be encoded in the amygdala of the brain, and that also has a rather sinister implication if we're talking about violence that has become biologically ingrained and so forth. But I don't want to preclude the possibility of the cultivation of eros through the means that our panelists have discussed, because I think they're quite profound. I have to apologize for not being able to take every question, because I know the people who are coming up to ask questions, but actually our panelists have to run to the airport, and we don't want them to miss their planes because of the discussion and so forth. So my apologies to you. I encourage you to ask your questions to the remaining panelists afterwards, and certainly communicate by email or any other means. We don't want to make you feel neglected or anything like that, but I'm afraid we've run out of time. So again, my apologies. I'd like to thank the distinguished panelists for coming from great distances and joining us, and to thank Dr. French for putting this together. I think this has been fantastic, and thank you for coming.